Silver Creek, Colorado Territory, 1878. A public wound opened that morning on the depot platform, and it would change Emmett Shaw's whole life before sundown, though not the way the woman who caused it ever intended. I'm the one bringing you this story tonight, and I promise you'll want to stay for every mile of it, because before the sun dropped behind the Sangre de Cristo Range that same day, a cowgirl who owed Emmett Shaw nothing at all would give him back everything Charlotte Porter had just taken from him in front of half the town. This is the story of how a rejected groom found the one woman on the whole frontier who could see exactly what he was worth. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a letter, a train, and a woman who never should have summoned him west in the first place. Emmett Shaw had been a careful man his whole life, the kind who balanced a ledger to the penny and never let a debt outrun a due date. And it was precisely that carefulness that had ruined him. His father's freight business in Missouri had gone under 2 winters back, taken down by a bad note co-signed for a partner who'd since vanished west. And when the old man died 6 months later of what the doctors named a weak heart, and Emmett privately blamed on shame, the whole of the debt settled onto his shoulders like a yoke he hadn't chosen to wear. He kept books at the county mill after that. Decent work, honest work, but it paid a young man's wage, and the note wanted a rich man's payment. And by the spring of 1878, Emmett had watched the last of his mother's jewelry go to a pawnbroker in Independence, and understood, with the plain arithmetic he trusted more than his own feelings, that he had exactly one asset left worth anything in the world. Himself. A sound back, a fair hand with figures, and a willingness to work that no creditor could repossess. An advertisement in a matrimonial paper had come to him by way of a friend, who hadn't much hoped it would come to anything. Widowed merchant, Silver Creek, Colorado Territory, wanted a capable, educated man to assist with store accounts and general management, marriage to follow a proper courtship by correspondence, preference for sober habits and a steady character. Emmett wrote back that same night, laying out his experience with figures plainly and without embellishment, because embellishment had never once served him, and he saw no reason to start now. The reply came from a Mrs. Charlotte Porter, 3 years widowed, running a dry goods store her late husband had built, and finding the bookkeeping and the loneliness both more than she cared to carry alone. Her letters were tidy, businesslike, occasionally warmer than Emmett expected, and over 4 months of correspondence he allowed himself, cautiously, the small dangerous luxury of hope. She valued competence. She valued a man who kept his word. Her third letter had used the phrase, "I believe we would suit each other well," and Emmett read that line so many times the paper went soft at the fold. When her final letter arrived with a bank draft for train fare and a request that he come west before the autumn freight season, he sold what little furniture remained in his mother's house, paid down what he could of the note, and boarded a westbound train with a single case and a debt he could finally see the far edge of. 6 days of travel had worn something raw into him, the endless plains giving way to foothills and then to mountains that looked carved rather than grown, and by the time the conductor announced Silver Creek, Emmett's hands had gone unsteady with a hope he hadn't let himself feel in 2 years. He stepped down onto the platform in his one good coat, case in hand, and found the town's main street already gathering the way small towns gather around anything new, ranch hands and shopkeepers, and a cluster of children pausing their game to stare at the stranger with the Eastern collar and the careful haircut. And there, standing apart from the crowd with a man Emmett didn't recognize close at her side, stood a tall, composed woman in dark blue wool, whose face matched the daguerreotype she'd sent him, closely enough that his heart, foolishly, lifted at the sight of her. Charlotte Porter did not come forward. She looked at him the way a buyer looks at a length of cloth she has already decided against, and when Emmett crossed the platform and spoke her name with the careful hope of a man who'd crossed a continent on the strength of her handwriting, her answer came loud enough that the whole gathered street heard it plainly. "Mr. Shaw, I'm afraid there has been a change of circumstance. My late husband's cousin has arrived from St. Louis to manage the store, and to see to my affairs, generally." She glanced at the man beside her, in a way that made the rest of it unnecessary. "I regret the inconvenience of your journey. There is money enough here for a hotel and a return ticket." She held out an envelope at arm's length, the way a person hands off something distasteful, wanting it out of her fingers as fast as possible. "I wish you well, Mr. Shaw." She did not wait for an answer. She turned, took the arm of the man beside her, and walked back down the platform while half of Silver Creek watched Emmett Shaw stand alone with an envelope of pity money and a case that held everything he owned in the world. He did not remember crossing the street afterward. He remembered only the alley behind the mercantile, the cool shadow of it, the way his back found the rough wood wall, and his legs simply stopped holding him up with any real conviction. The sound of his own breathing, ragged and humiliated, away from the crowd's eyes at last. 2 years of debt and grief and careful, patient hope, spent on a woman who hadn't even waited for him to set down his case before discarding him. Nothing left. No position, no prospects, barely enough pride to keep him upright, and a return ticket to a town where every creditor he'd ever owed would know within a week exactly how he had failed. "Some help," he breathed to the empty alley, not entirely sure whether he meant it for a prayer or a curse. "You look like a man who just got his horse shot out from under him and his house burned down in the same afternoon." The voice came from the mouth of the alley, low and unhurried, and Emmett looked up to find a woman watching him with an expression that held curiosity but not one drop of pity, the exact thing, he'd think much later, that made him able to answer her at all. She was perhaps 30, sun-browned and sturdy through the shoulders, in a way no Boston parlor would ever have named ladylike, and every Colorado rancher would have named capable, dark hair braided back plain and practical beneath a wide hat, wearing denim and a man's work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a plain confidence that had nothing to do with anyone's permission. Close enough. Something almost like humor surprised him by surviving in his own voice. "I take it you saw all that. Whole street saw it." Not unkindly. "I'm Cora Danforth. I run Cottonwood Bend, about 7 miles west of here, and I was in Porter's not 20 minutes ago, buying nails when the clerk warned Charlotte word would get around town over what she was about to do." "I don't need anyone's sympathy, Miss Danforth." Didn't offer any. That was an observation, not sympathy. There's a difference, and you'll want to learn it if you're planning on staying in this territory, because sympathy runs out around here a lot faster than opinions do. Emmett studied her, waiting for the catch, the angle, the thing every hard week of his life had trained him to look for in a stranger's kindness. But Cora Danforth held his eyes steadily and didn't look away, and there was nothing in her bearing that asked anything of him beyond a plain answer. "What do you want, Miss Danforth?" "A man who can keep accounts straight and isn't afraid of a full day's work. My foreman married a school teacher this spring and took himself off with her to Denver, and I've been running the books and the herd both ever since, which is one job too many even for me. Someone who can manage the ledgers, ride when the season calls for it, and not flinch at getting his hands dirty in between. Based on what I just watched, you're out of a position and a place to sleep both tonight. I'm offering to fix both those at once. You don't know a single thing about me. I know you kept your feet under you, standing in front of the whole town, while a woman humiliated you plain and public, and I know you didn't say one ugly word back to her, which tells me more about your character than a letter of reference ever could. 3 months trial, room and board, $25 a month. Proper contract, my terms in writing so there's no confusion later, and at the end of it we both decide whether it's working. If it isn't, you'll have wages saved and time to figure your next move, instead of crawling back to Missouri with nothing but that ticket in your pocket." Emmett turned the offer over the way he'd have turned any account that crossed his desk, hunting for the hidden liability. Fair terms, almost too fair. They're my terms because it's my ranch. I don't offer what I can't deliver, and I don't ask for anything I haven't put in writing first. That's the whole of it. She held out her hand, weathered and certain, and after a long moment, Emmett Shaw shook it. "There's an old line from Annie Oakley that fits this part of the story better than anything I could write myself. 'Aim at a high mark,' she once put it, 'and you will hit it. Do not be content with a low aim and easily satisfied.'" Cora Danforth had never read those words in her life, but she'd have agreed with every one of them, because from that very first minute in that alley, she aimed her whole intention at a man the rest of Silver Creek had already written off as not worth the trouble, and she never once considered lowering it. The wagon ride to Cottonwood Bend carried them west, through country that grew wilder with every mile. pine forest closing over the road, and mountains rising sharp and blue-shadowed against a sky Emmett hadn't yet learned to trust. Cora handled the team with an easy, unhurried competence, pointing out landmarks along the way, a lightning-split pine, a creek crossing, the ridge where she'd once tracked a mountain lion 3 days running before it finally gave up on her calves and moved on. You'll want to remember these markers. Get lost out here, and the mountains all start looking the same by dusk. I've never ridden much, Emmett admitted, bracing for the judgment Charlotte Porter would have handed him, without a second's hesitation. Cora only nodded, unbothered. Then you'll learn. Levi's patient with green riders. He'll have you sitting a horse properly inside 2 weeks. She delivered it the way a person states a fact of weather, not a favor being granted, and something in Emmett's chest loosened at the plainness of it. The sheer absence of pity in how easily she'd decided he was capable of learning something new. They crested a rise as the light went gold, and the valley opened below them all at once. A fast creek cutting silver through green pasture, cattle scattered dark against the grass. A solid 2-story house of log and stone with a wide porch and smoke rising from the chimney. Outbuildings clustered near a well-kept barn. Cottonwood Bend. Pride sat plain and unashamed in her voice. Built most of it myself, after my father passed, with help from good hands when I could afford them. 8 years to get it to where it stands now. It's beautiful, Emmett managed, and meant it entirely. It's home. She clicked the team forward and started them down the slope. 2 men came out from the barn as the wagon pulled in. Roy Calder, silver-haired and pushing 60 with a face weathered into a permanent squint, and Jonas Pratt, younger, quiet, watchful in a way that took Emmett's measure without a single word passing between them. "This is Mr. Shaw," Cora said, swinging down from the wagon bench. "He's managing the books and helping wherever else is needed. 3 months trial, starting tomorrow." Roy swept off his hat with exaggerated courtesy that didn't quite hide his curiosity, and Jonas gave a single measuring nod, and Emmett understood he was being weighed against some private standard he'd have to earn his way past, rather than talk his way past it. The house itself told its own honest tale once Cora led him through it. Solid bones and good craftsmanship buried under the particular chaos of a ranch too short-handed to keep proper order. Ledgers and receipts scattered across a table in the main room, in a state that made Emmett's careful hands itch before he'd even set down his case. "I did warn you the books were a disaster." "That's not disaster. Already sorting the nearest stack by pure instinct. That's just neglect. Disaster I could work with, neglect I can fix." He started the next morning before Cora had finished her coffee, and by the end of the first week, he had untangled 8 months of muddled entries into columns that balanced, cross-checked every invoice against what had actually been paid, and found, buried in the confusion, an error in the feed supplier's favor that had quietly overcharged Cottonwood Bend for the better part of a year. Cora studied the corrected figures a long moment at the kitchen table, then looked up at him with an expression Emmett hadn't seen turned his way since long before his father died. "That's $40 a year I've been bleeding without knowing it. How long would that have taken you to find on your own, Miss Danforth?" "Long enough that I finally stopped being too proud to admit I needed the help." Rare honesty, plainly given, which apparently was exactly as long as it took a rejected groom to fall into my alley. Roy, watching from the doorway with his coffee, laughed loud enough to startle the dog. Trouble arrived on a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks in the shape of Wade Hollis and his 2 younger cousins, riding up the lane on good horses, dressed in their Sunday best. Wade owned the neighboring spread and had been courting Cora, unsuccessfully and at length, for the better part of 5 years, a persistence that had less to do with affection than with the plain fact that Cottonwood Bend's water rights would double the value of Hollis land if the 2 ranches ever merged under one roof. He dismounted stiff and formal, and Emmett, coming up from the barn at the sound of hooves, understood immediately this wasn't a friendly visit. "Cora, no pleasantries. Folks in town are talking, and I came out as a neighbor to say plain what they're saying." A woman alone on a ranch with a strange man under her roof, one she picked up out of an alley not a month back, and nobody but 2 hired hands for propriety. It doesn't sit right. "My household is my own concern, Wade." The same iron Emmett had heard in her voice the day she offered him a handshake in an alley. It concerns the whole valley when it's the talk of every store counter in Silver Creek. I'm only saying what a friend ought to say. Hire it done proper through an agency if you need a bookkeeper that badly, and folks will stop wondering what exactly you're running out here. You mean, what exactly I'm running instead of marrying you. Flat, final. Wade's jaw tightened in a way that made plain she'd landed the true shape of it. Emmett stepped forward before he'd fully decided to, and found his own voice steadier than he expected. Mr. Hollis, I understand the appearance concerns you, but I'd ask you to consider the appearance of a woman being lectured by 3 unmarried men on how she runs her own household. Miss Danforth gave me honest work when I had nothing left in this world but a return ticket and a debt I couldn't see the end of. I don't intend to apologize for accepting it, and I don't much care what it looks like from Hollis land. Wade's cousins shifted, uncomfortable, but Wade himself only stared at Emmett with open contempt. Big words for a man half the county watched get thrown over on a train platform 3 weeks back. The old shame tried to rise in Emmett's chest, and for the first time since that platform, he found he could look straight through it. That happened. I won't pretend it didn't. But I'd rather be a man discarded once by someone unworthy of him than a man who spends his Sundays trying to bully a capable woman out of running her own ranch her own way. Cora, watching, didn't hide the small, fierce satisfaction crossing her face. I believe you've made your point, Wade. Off my land, please, before this stops being neighborly on my end too. Wade held Cora's gaze a long moment, weighing something, then swung back up onto his horse without another word, his cousins trailing him down the lane with apologetic backward glances. Cora watched them go, then turned to Emmett with something warmer than approval in her expression. Nobody stood up for me like that in longer than I care to admit. I didn't stand up for you. I told the plain truth. Sometimes that's the same thing. For a moment, neither of them looked away. The weeks that followed settled into something Emmett hadn't dared hope for since his father's funeral. A rhythm of honest work and plain respect, mornings spent riding fence lines under Jonas's patient instruction, until his seat steadied and his hands stopped fighting the reins. Afternoons over the ledgers with Cora leaning across the table to check his figures against her own memory of the herd. Evenings around Roy's cooking, which improved considerably once Emmett showed him how to season a stew with something besides optimism. He learned the shape of Cora Danforth slowly, the way she checked every fence twice a season out of habit rather than distrust, the small private smile she allowed herself when a calving went well, the fierce, unshowy loyalty she carried for anyone who'd earned it honestly. She learned, in turn, that the careful, cautious man who'd stepped off that train carried a dry humor buried under the caution, and a stubbornness about doing a job right that matched her own exactly. By his second month at Cottonwood Bend, Emmett had rebuilt not just the ledgers but the whole rhythm of how the ranch kept its own accounting of itself, a running record of feed costs and calving dates and creek levels that Roy took to calling the boss's other boss, and Cora, examining it one evening, with something close to wonder on her face, allowed that she hadn't seen numbers this clean since her father's own hand had kept them, years before consumption took him. Emmett found himself, in those quiet evenings, telling her things he hadn't told anyone since his father's funeral, the particular shame of watching a family's good name go under a stack of unpaid notes, the strange relief of finally being somewhere his worth was measured by the work of his hands and not the size of an inheritance. Cora listened the way she did everything, without interrupting, without rushing to comfort him past what the moment called for, and when he'd finished, she only said that a man who could speak plainly about his own failures was a rarer thing on this frontier than a man who pretended he'd never had any. Sunday afternoons, when the work allowed it, she taught him to sit a horse properly herself instead of leaving the whole job to Jonas, patient in a way that surprised him every time, correcting his grip on the reins with a light touch that lingered a beat longer than strictly necessary, and neither one of them remarked on it. The real test came in October, when an early storm rolled down off the peaks, faster than anyone had tracked it, dropping the temperature 20 degrees in an hour and driving a scattering of cattle toward the swollen creek at the north end of the property before the light failed entirely. Cora was already in the saddle and calling orders before Emmett had fully grasped what was happening, and he went after her without a second's hesitation, Jonas and Roy fanning wide to turn the herd, while Cora and Emmett rode the creek line itself, trying to keep the frightened cattle from crossing into water, running too high and too fast for safe footing. A young heifer bolted straight for the bank in the worst possible spot, and Cora spurred after it without hesitation, her horse's hooves skidding on mud gone treacherous in the driving rain, and for one long, terrible second, Emmett watched her mount stumble at the very edge of the current. He was off his own horse and into the water before he'd weighed the sense of it, catching the heifer's lead and hauling hard enough to turn its head, while Cora fought her own horse back onto solid ground. Both of them soaked through and shaking with cold and adrenaline in equal measure, once the animal was finally secured on dry footing. "You could have been killed!" Breathless, staring at him like she was seeing him fully for the first time. "So could you. I wasn't about to watch it happen from the bank." They stood there in the freezing rain a moment longer than the situation strictly required, and something passed between them that neither one put into words that night, though both of them carried it back to the house all the same. Word of what had happened on that train platform made its way around Silver Creek exactly as Charlotte Porter should have expected it would, and it made its way, eventually, back to her as well, twisted and reshaped the way any good story gets reshaped in a small town, that the rejected groom had landed on his feet at Cottonwood Bend, and was, by every account, reaching the mercantile counter, thriving there in a way that made Charlotte's own choice look considerably less clever with every passing month. She kept it to herself, but the clerk who'd once managed her store noticed she went quiet whenever his name came up, and quieter still, the Sunday she watched Cora Danforth and her bookkeeper ride into town together, easy and unhurried, to buy nails and post a letter, looking for all the world like two people who'd already settled something neither of them had put into plain words yet. The 3 months came due on a clear, cold evening in late November, the kind of evening that made the whole valley look carved from silver, and Cora found Emmett on the porch after supper, going over the last of the season's accounts by lamplight, out of habit more than necessity. "Trial's up tomorrow." She settled into the chair beside him without waiting to be invited, which she never had needed to be. "I know. I've been dreading this conversation, if I'm honest." "Why?" Real uncertainty in the question, the first he'd ever heard from her. "Because I don't want it to end at fair wages and a handshake." He set the ledger aside. "I want it to be my home, Cora, not just my employment. I want that a great deal more than I've wanted anything since before my father died. And I didn't know how to say it without risking the one good thing that's happened to me in 2 years." Cora went quiet a long moment, watching the last light drain out of the western sky, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone careful, in a way Emmett had never once heard from her. "I want to ask you something plainly, because that's the only way I know how to ask anything. I don't want a bookkeeper anymore, Emmett. I never really did, not entirely. I want a partner on this land, and I want a husband, if that's a thing you'd choose for yourself, knowing exactly who I am and how I run things. Ask me properly." Something broke open warm in his chest. Cora Danforth took both his hands in hers, weathered and certain, the same hands that had offered him a contract in an alley 3 months back, and asked him again in full, and his answer came without a single second's hesitation. Yes, obviously, yes. They married in December. In the front room Emmett had once found buried under 3 months of scattered ledgers, with Roy crying once and denying it loudly, and Jonas smiling in the quiet way that was the closest he ever came to it, and half of Silver Creek in attendance, despite everything Wade Hollis had once predicted about talk and scandal, because a town that watches a man rebuild himself from nothing generally comes around to admiring him for it. Even Thomas Meade, who had once handed Emmett a rejection envelope across a store counter and watched him walk away with nothing, rode out for the ceremony and stayed for the whole of it, allowing afterward that it was the finest thing he'd witnessed happen to a man he'd once been ashamed to have delivered bad news to. Charlotte Porter did not attend, though she sent, some weeks later, a brief and stiffly worded note of congratulations that Emmett read once, felt nothing much at all about, and filed away without malice in a drawer he never opened again. Cora Danforth had built Cottonwood Bend back into something whole with her own 2 hands, long before any man ever walked up her lane, and what she gave Emmett Shaw that winter was never charity and had never been charity. It was a home, freely chosen by a woman who needed no one's permission to run her own land or choose her own husband. Emmett had lost everything on a train platform in front of half a town and found, that very same afternoon, the one person on the whole frontier capable of seeing exactly what he was worth. The ranch itself grew steadier in the years that followed, the way anything grows steadier once it is tended by two people instead of one who is stretching herself thin, trying to be two. Emmett's ledgers expanded to cover a second herd Cora bought outright the following spring, paid for in cash she hadn't dared spend before she'd had a partner she trusted to help her weigh the risk of it. And Roy grew old and slower, and no less ornery, teaching a new hired hand the same stew recipe Emmett had once rescued from ruin. Jonas married a rancher's daughter from 2 valleys over, and stayed on anyway, because Cottonwood Bend had become the kind of place people who found it were reluctant to leave. Word of the rejected Groom, who'd become the finest bookkeeper and one of the steadiest hands in the county, traveled well past Silver Creek eventually, the way any good story does out on a frontier hungry for them, though by then, Emmett Shaw had stopped thinking of himself as a man anyone had ever rejected at all. He thought of himself, when he thought of it, as a man a cowgirl in an alley had once looked at and decided, on the spot and against every practical argument the whole valley could raise, was worth keeping. Folks in Silver Creek still carry the story a dozen different ways, most of them getting the shape of it a little wrong in the retelling. Some claim a rich rancher took pity on a drifter. Others swear Wade Hollis got exactly what was coming to him for meddling where he wasn't wanted. Cora never bothered correcting any of it in town. She corrected it only once, in her own words, the night of their wedding, standing on the porch with Emmett's hand in hers, and the whole valley gone silver under a hard winter moon. "I loved you before you ever arrived," she gave him quietly, "though neither of us knew it yet. I just had to wait for the whole town to throw you away, before I got the chance to prove it. If you found your way to this one tonight, thank you for staying with Cora and Emmett, all the way to the end." We bring you stories like this every week here on Cowgirl Chronicles. Quiet, capable women who build something worth having with their own 2 hands, and the good men lucky enough to be chosen by them. If that's the kind of evening you're after, you know where to find us. Until the next one, take care of yourselves.